His cabin was never meant to be anything more than a retreat from the noise of the world. Nestled deep within the forest, a few miles outside the edge of a sprawling, over-manicured neighborhood, it stood on land the protagonist had purchased years ago after retiring from an elite SWAT unit. Surrounded by tall pines, silent lakes, and the occasional deer trail, the cabin offered the serenity and control he had missed during years of chaotic high-stakes service. The air was clean, the silence was honest, and the solitude was earned. He'd built it with his own hands, stone by stone, nail by nail, with security in mind and peace in heart. He never imagined that trouble would follow him to the woods. But it did. The trouble came in khakis and clipboards, holding rulebooks like weapons. It started with a letter that came taped to his Gaytan official, looking warning that he was violating HOA landscaping regulations. He laughed it off at first. His land wasn't part of the HOA. It sat a full mile outside the neighborhood boundary, a fact clearly recorded in the county registry. He tossed the letter into the fire pit. Days later, another envelope arrived, this time by courier. The tone was more aggressive. It demanded compliance with community standards regarding paint color, fencing, and waste disposal. The kicker, a fine of $500 for nonconformity. Went into town and visited the county clerk. Sure enough, the property was not under HOA control. It's not even close. The clerk confirmed it, even gave him a printed boundary map. Confident in the law and his ownership, the protagonist sent a certified letter to the HOA with all documents attached. Weeks went by with no reply, until the visits began. At first, they were subtle and unfamiliar SUV parked down the hill. A man with a camera pretending to be lost. A woman in workout gear jogging past the gate multiple times a day. New surveillance tactics when he saw them. These weren't random civilians. Someone was checking patterns, measuring response times, studying angles. The instincts drilled into him from years in the field came alive again. He set up his own counter-surveillance. Cameras hidden in tree knots, trip sensors buried in leaves, and a network of alerts linked to his satellite phone. If anyone stepped too close, he'd know. Then came the conversation that changed everything. He caught a man walking the perimeter with a clipboard, claiming to be from the HOA security committee. When confronted, the man insisted the land had recently been annexed into the community. When asked for documents, he produced a forged map and a badge that looked suspiciously homemade. That was the moment the protagonist knew this wasn't incompetence. It was an operation. Someone with access to power and resources was pushing a false narrative deliberately and strategically. Instead of backing down, he dug in. He researched the HOA's board members, their financials, their connections to real estate developers. One name kept popping up, a man with investments in short-term rentals and a history of legal manipulation. The theory became clear. They wanted the land, not for regulation, but for acquisition. And if they couldn't buy it, they'd harass it out of his hands. He'd seen this type of abuse before in war zones, in corrupt departments, in corporate security. And he knew that when people start testing boundaries, they don't stop until they're punished. But what the HOA didn't realize was that they hadn't targeted a helpless homeowner. They'd stirred the wrong hornet's nest. The cabin wasn't just a home, it was a fortress. And the man who built it hadn't forgotten how to defend it. The weeks that followed were a slow but steady escalation of pressure. After the failed intimidation attempt by the man with the fake badge, the protagonist thought they might retreat. Instead, the HOA doubled down. Their next move was a barrage of official-looking documents that arrived almost daily, some mailed. Others left suspiciously. In person on his porch, even though his gate was always locked. Each one cited fabricated infractions, unapproved structures, unauthorized fencing, light pollution, and even wildlife endangerment. They were printed on imitation legal letterhead, complete with bogus enforcement codes. But he knew real codes. He'd worked alongside federal and state enforcement agencies for over 2 decades. These papers were nothing but a tactic to instill fear and confusion. But what disturbed him most wasn't the paperwork. It was the tone. The document shifted from passive-aggressive to threatening. One warned that persistent noncompliance will result in forceful correction. Another claimed The HOA had the authority to conduct a mandatory inspection at a time of their choosing. He brought these to a local lawyer who laughed at their illegality, but noted something important. The HOA had retained a private security firm recently known for shady dealingsmen who wore badges that looked real enough to fool average people and acted as if they had the authority to detain. The protagonist recognized the game. The HOA wasn't just some overzealous board. Someone with money and ego was behind this, and they were laying the groundwork to use force under the illusion of law. He started spotting the same black SUVs more frequently, parked farther up the road but within sight. His cameras caught individuals in tactical gear loitering near the tree line. One even walked up to the window of his cabin at midnight and peered inside before vanishing into the dark. It wasn't random. These men were doing reconnaissance, calculating blind spots, entry points, vulnerabilities. They were preparing for a raid. But unlike criminals or police, these weren't amateurs. And they weren't professionals either. They were mercenaries, playing cop. That made them unpredictable. So he responded the way he was trained to, by going dark and preparing for contact. He didn't report it to the local police. It's too slow, too bureaucratic, and frankly, too naive to deal with this kind of operation. Instead, he reached out to his old team. Men who didn't need explanations, just coordinates. Most of them were still active, working in private tactical firms, federal agencies, or teaching high-level defensive courses. When he told them what was happening, there was no hesitation. They knew what this was, a group abusing the pretense of authority, counting on fear and confusion to silence their target. The team had seen it overseas, on American soil, in cartel country, and in corporate security. They agreed on one thing. This wasn't going to end with paperwork. He began staging his property like a controlled zone. Cameras were upgraded to thermal and night vision. Entry paths were narrowed and alarmed. His team ran mock drills over the terrain, silently embedding motion sensors and camouflaged observation posts into the hillside. No detail was left to chance. This was no longer a game of legal disputes. It was now a tactical response to an unlawful assault. But the protagonist understood something the HOA didn't. Authority means nothing if it's built on lies. These men might wear fake uniforms, carry imitation badges, and drive blacked out vehicles, but they weren't ready to face men who lived and breathed in real-world chaos. The HOA believed they were dealing with a recluse veteran hiding in a cabin. What they were actually facing was a strategist, someone who knew how to wait, watch, and strike only when the trap was fully set, and the trap was almost ready. The decision to bait the intruders didn't come lightly. The protagonist understood the risk. He had spent years orchestrating raids, running high-stakes operations where one wrong move could cost lives. But this wasn't just a matter of harassment anymore, it was a coordinated attempt to break his will through illegal intimidation. The HOA had proven they would cross lines, and he was done playing defense. If they were going to push further, he would make sure they walked straight into a situation they couldn't control. And this time, they wouldn't be the ones setting the terms. He began by altering his visible routine. Every morning for a week, he loaded his truck with gear, waved at the hidden cameras around the property, and drove off just before sunrise. He made stops in nearby towns, stayed visible, checked into motels with his name on the ledger. The point was to make it look like he was truly gone out of town, distracted, vulnerable. But in reality, he returned to the cabin each night through a back trail known only to a handful of locals. He parked his truck in a camouflaged garage built into the terrain, one of many precautions he had implemented after his first encounter with the false enforcers. His SWAT brothers arrived discreetly, rotating in small groups. Some stayed hidden in the nearby woods in ghillie suits, blending into the brush like shadows. Others worked the perimeter, placing motion sensors under leaves and deploying concealed wireless cameras that transmitted to a secure feed. High on the ridge, a former sniper turned tactical instructor set up an overwatch post with clear visual angles on every approach. The cabin became the eye of a silent storm, a target, dressed to look deserted but surrounded by trained professionals who knew exactly what was coming. Inside, The protagonist rewired the cabin's entire security system. Doors were reinforced, windows booby-trapped with silent alarms, and a thermal trip sensor lined the entire porch. He also set up recording systems inside hidden microphones and lamps, motion-activated cameras behind the wall panels, and data backups that uploaded automatically to a secure cloud server. Everything was designed to collect undeniable evidence. While remaining invisible to the untrained eye, it wasn't just about confrontation. It was about exposure proving, once and for all, that this was a planned invasion under the guise of regulation. The plan was simple: make them think he was gone, wait for them to strike, and catch them in the act. But even with everything in place, the protagonist remained on edge. Not from fear, but from instinct. The type of people who would dress up private contractors in fake police gear weren't just rule breakers. They were arrogant, reckless, dangerous. The kind who thought money and power put them above the law. That kind of overconfidence made them volatile, especially when cornered. While his team waited in the forest, he monitored the feeds obsessively. He tracked the black SUV that had been circling the area every other day. Stopped near the cabin's front path for almost 20 minutes. 2 men stepped out, walked around with flashlights, and then left. They weren't casing the place anymore. They were confirming. They believed he was gone. They were preparing to make their move. The next morning, the team held a final briefing in whispers beneath the cover of a dense cedar grove. No one needed much instruction. These men had operated in war zones and urban raids across the world. They knew exactly how to blend into terrain, how to let a threat walk into a controlled space, and how to end it with minimal confrontation but maximum consequence. No shots would be fired unless absolutely necessary. The goal was capture and exposure, not escalation. Everything was in place. The bait had been laid. The cabin stood quiet, empty to the eye, the front door's broken lock practically inviting. But all around it, hidden in silence and shadow, the real law waited patiently for trespassers to make the first move. At 3:07 a.m., the sound of tires rolling over gravel pierced the silence like a whisper of chaos. The thermal cameras lit up, revealing 3 black SUVs crawling up the road with headlights off, their silhouettes sharp against the cool night air. The protagonist, watching the live feed from his hidden surveillance room beneath the cabin, didn't flinch. He had expected this exact moment. Every step they took now had already been planned, for each movement measured, anticipated, and watched from more angles than they could ever imagine. The vehicles came to a stop just beyond the tree line, right where the blind spots used to be before he repositioned the cameras. The doors opened, almost in sync, and 6 men stepped out. Dressed in dark tactical uniforms with fake police insignias sewn onto their shoulders, their faces were partially obscured by balaclavas, and each carried what looked like batons, flashlights, and sidearms in imitation duty belts. They moved with forced confidence, like men pretending to be something they were not. But to someone trained in real tactical movement, it was obvious. Their formation was clumsy, their communication erratic, and their threat detection nearly non-existent. 2 men approached the gate, clipped a lock with bolt cutters, and silently waved the rest forward. They believed no one was home. That belief made them reckless. As they crept up to the cabin's front door, they failed to notice the near-invisible motion trip sensor embedded in the gravel. It sent a silent signal to the overwatch post in the woods and triggered a soft red glow on the HUDs of the SWAT team members positioned around the perimeter. The trap was now fully active. One of the fake cops yanked the front door handle, locked. He didn't bother picking it. He simply smashed it open with a steel battering ram. Laughing as the wood splintered and the alarm beeped once, then fell silent. The group entered like a pack of wolves, stepping over the threshold into what they thought was an abandoned structure. Flashlights scanned the walls. 1 man knocked over a lamp. Another kicked a chair across the room. They weren't searching for anything. They were destroying, intimidating, making a mess to send a message. But what they didn't know was that every move was being recorded from multiple angles. The protagonist watched as one of the intruders pulled out a small gasoline can and poured a streak across the kitchen floor. Another opened a backpack filled with small tools likely to simulate evidence of code violations or unsafe modifications. Their mission wasn't just to scare, it was to destroy, fabricate, and discredit, and that was the cue in the woods. The quiet snap of fingers set the plan in motion. Act! Within seconds, floodlights hidden in the trees exploded to life, bathing the cabin and its surroundings in harsh, blinding white light. A voice boomed through a loudspeaker. "This is a lawful operation. Drop your weapons and lie face down on the floor." Panic overtook the intruders. One ran toward the back door, but was instantly met by two operators in full gear. Weapons drawn. Another reached for his fake badge, only to be tackled and restrained by a canine unit. Within 90 seconds, every man was zip-tied, face down, disarmed, and surrounded. The protagonist stepped through the doorway in full tactical gear, not as a victim, but as the commander of the operation. He walked past the broken door, glanced at the spilled gasoline, and looked each man in the eye without a word. On the ground near one of their belts, a radio crackled. A voice came through, familiar and confident. "Are we clear?" It was a board member from the HOA. Now, the truth wasn't just exposed, it was recorded, undeniable and actionable. The aftermath was immediate and explosive. Within hours, the local sheriff's department arrived on the scene, their cruisers lighting up the forest like a Christmas parade. Though the protagonist had already informed them of a potential incident in advance, even they were stunned at what they encountered. 6 men dressed as law enforcement, restrained by a trained tactical team, zip-tied. With a mountain of video and audio evidence detailing every second of their break-in, there was no ambiguity, there was no room for excuse. The sheriff, a man who had served in the military himself, took one look at the evidence and nodded grimly. "They're done," he said. The fake cops were taken into custody, their bogus badges and forged IDs confiscated on the spot. Every weapon, every tool, every document was bagged and logged. As they were loaded into the cruisers, some of them tried to explain themselves, insisting they were hired to carry out a legal inspection. But the real police weren't buying it, especially after hearing the HOA board member's voice come through the confiscated radio, giving instructions in real time. The link between the attackers and the HOA was no longer speculation, it was direct, recorded, and damning. By the next morning, local news outlets had picked up the story. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Porters tried to approach the property line, only to be turned away by deputies maintaining the integrity of the scene. Word spread quickly. A retired SWAT officer had thwarted a coordinated assault on his property by men hired under false authority by an HOA gone rogue. Social media lit up with outrage. Residents from nearby neighborhoods shared their own stories of overreach and bullying by homeowners associations. The protagonist, without intending to, had become a symbol of resistance, someone who fought back not with anger, but with precision, legality, and overwhelming readiness. Lawsuits began flying in every direction. The HOA board member identified on the radio was arrested and charged with conspiracy, impersonating law enforcement, and orchestrating a felony-level home invasion. Others on the board were subpoenaed and brought in for questioning. Financial records began to unravel a deeper scheme, plans to pressure certain homeowners into giving up properties that the board then flipped for profit through a connected network of real estate firms. The cabin wasn't the first target, but it was the one that exposed everything. The protagonist's lawyer filed a civil suit that same week for damages, harassment, trespassing, and emotional distress. But it wasn't about the money, it was about principle. For too long, people had been bullied under the pretense of community rules, manipulated by people hiding behind printed bylaws and cheap uniforms. Now, those people were facing real consequences. And the cabin, once a personal refuge, had become the stage for a public reckoning. As the weeks passed, things settled. The cabin's door was repaired, security systems upgraded again, and his team returned to their respective homes and lives. They didn't need thanks. They had done what they always did, handled the mission with skill and integrity. Returned to his routine, the silence of the woods wrapping around him once more. But this time, the quiet wasn't uneasy. It was victorious. He sat on the porch, a mug of black coffee,